and introduce our guest speaker, Silvia Marquez. Silvia currently serves as an associate director in the Financial Aid and Scholarships Office as the HSI implementation manager for the University of California, Berkeley. She's the daughter of Mexican immigrants who were low income and worked in El Tomate in the Central Valley. She was born and raised in Stockton and is a first-gen college student, holds a bachelor's in social welfare from Berkeley, a master's in public administration from CSU East Bay, and is currently working on her doctorate in educational leadership at UC Davis. She is 100% a product of public education. Silvia also has over 20 years, of student service experience in higher education, including director roles in both financial aid and admissions. And in her current role, allows her to advance DEIB initiatives on the Berkeley campus and within the UC system. So we're very honored to have her as our guest speaker. And without further ado, Silvia, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank her Vagabond Roots for having me today. Thank you all for making time to do this. Financial aid is not super exciting and it's kind of hard to make it fun. So I really appreciate that you're here today because this is just so critical to moving toward your in your educational journey. So a few goals for today, or really just one. I really hope that we can do some myth busting. There typically tends to be a lot of misinformation out there about financial aid. So I hope we can do some of that. I also hope that I'm going to give you a lot of information. So if it doesn't all stick, that's okay. My hope is that you will have some language and some terms and some key things to think about so that you know what questions to ask when you're at the point of moving into higher education and have financial aid in front of you or are thinking about it to help move you along through the journey. Before we get started though, one thing I would really like to do is find out who's in the room, because I think that's going to help guide the conversation for today. So if you could in the chat, what would really help me is let me know where you are in your educational journey. So are you in high school? What year in high school are you in high school? Or are you in community college? Are you at another four-year institution? Just let me know in the chat really quickly where you are in your educational journey. So I'm going to give that just a couple minutes so I know who's in the room. All right, we'll just keep going. I'm not seeing too many answers in the chat. So let's go ahead and keep it moving, but it would be great. Okay, seniors in high school, excellent. All right, community college, all right, close to transferring. Parent who has a senior, perfect. This is great. Thank you all so much. This is helpful. So we have a pretty good spread of who's in the room. Great. Sophomore in high school?
Hello?
Senior in high school. Great. So that's super helpful for me. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to talk a lot today. So I'm just going to put that out there now. What I would love for folks to do is if you have questions, write them down or put them in the chat, because we're going to facilitate some time at the end for questions. It just makes it a little bit easier if I can go through all of it, and then we can have more in-depth conversation at the end. And then just remember what was shared at the beginning, which was if we're going to ask questions, let's be thoughtful about asking questions in a general way, because this is recorded and will be on a public website. And so I just want to make sure that we're being mindful and protecting your personal information during this session. So a few things that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to give you general information and timelines, and really I'm going to focus on, for the most part, I'm going to be focusing on public institutions. So CSUs, UCs, and then I'll point out when I'm talking about FAFSA versus a DREAM application versus in-state, out-of-state, private school. So I'll point those things out, but just know that the vast majority of my experience has been with public institutions. Okay, we'll talk about awarding philosophies, and so how give you some context for how schools award financial aid and how that can be different at a public institution versus a private institution, and also out of state. And we'll talk a bit about how we determine who has financial need, who's demonstrating greater financial need than others. How do we come up with that? And then how financial aid awards play into that, and some of the typical awards that are available at most institutions. We'll talk a bit about affordability. So I'll give you all that information. And then we'll actually digest it a little bit to talk about whether you can afford to go to a certain kind of school or not, and how to compare whether one school is a better deal than the other, so that you have some tools in place when the time comes. We'll talk a little bit about appeals and special circumstances, especially over the last 2 years, things have really shifted for many families. And so it's important to understand how to go about the process of asking an institution to reevaluate your financial aid if they can. And then we'll talk a little bit about resources and reminders at the end. I'll give you a sense of what Berkeley does, and hopefully that'll give you some language or some questions to ask of those institutions that you are considering if it's not Berkeley. This is not meant to be Berkeley specific. Okay, so that's the agenda for today. So let's go ahead and get started, because we do have quite a bit to cover. So let's just talk about general information and timelines. General information and timelines. So really basic stuff. What is financial aid? And when folks say financial aid, I think the assumption that a lot of students and families and supporters make is that we're talking about just grants and scholarships. And that's not necessarily the case. When we talk about financial aid on a campus, we're talking about all forms of financial aid. So grants and scholarships, which are the best forms of financial aid because they are free money that you do not have to pay back. They do not accrue interest. It's basically gift. It's like a gift. And so we often refer to it as gift aid because, when you receive a gift, you don't have to pay for it or give it back. And then there are other forms of financial aid that include work study and loans. And we'll talk a little bit about each of these a little bit later, but it's just important to know that these are the typical types of aid. When we say financial aid, we mean all of it, and that does include loans. So just keep that in the back of your mind. And the purpose of all of these awards is for the student to pay for their educational expenses. Well, what's included in your educational expenses? We'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation, but just keep that in mind, that's what we're talking about when we say financial aid. And then how to apply for financial aid. I strongly encourage you to review the requirements at the schools that you are interested in. So for the most part, what I'm going to be talking about here is going to be for public schools. So at a public institution like mine, the way that a student would apply for financial aid is you're either going to file the free application for federal student aid, which is often referred to as the FAFSA, or the California DREAM Act application. And the difference between those two, the FAFSA is for US citizens and permanent residents of the United States. So there's that. If you don't meet those requirements, however, you are a California resident and you meet the requirements for in-state tuition under AB 540, then you might qualify for financial aid under the California DREAM Act. And so these are typically our students that are undocumented, but do qualify for in-state tuition. And there are very specific requirements around it, and you'll see the websites there. On the CSAC website, which is where the DREAM Act application lives, you will find more information about how to qualify under AB 540. So I do encourage you to take a look at those requirements if this is the application that you would do. So it's either one of those two applications. And then the other thing that we ask our students to do is we want to make sure that you are taking advantage of all forms of financial aid that are out there, including state funding and the Cal Grant, which would pay for the system-wide tuition at a UC or a Cal State University, would come from a Cal Grant. And so there is this one separate application for that, and it's called the GPA verification form. your high school and your community college can, you should check in with those offices, your counselors, the registrar's office, to find out if they've already sent that for you, because they should be able to do it for you, and it should be electronic for the most part. I think all schools are electronic at this point. So you want to make sure that you're getting that done as well. And the deadlines for all this stuff, they are different. They can be different based on the school. In California, the deadline is March 2nd. So it's important to know that the application is open right now. So if you are a senior or you are a community college student that's going to transfer for fall of next year or spring of next year, you definitely want to be working on your aid application now. It's open. They open on October 1st for the upcoming academic year. So they kind of align with the college admissions applications, right? For the most part. And so just, it's important to know that if you're going to go out of California, outside, those deadlines might be different for the FAFSA application. If you are an undocumented student and you're considering financial aid, you definitely want to, and you might be thinking of going out of state, you definitely want to check to see if they even offer financial aid in that state to undocumented students. Each state is very, very different. So I would encourage you to do a little bit of research around what might be available for you. And then outside of this, so that gives you a pretty good sense of what most public schools do within California. There are private schools, of course, within California. They may have a different application. So they might do the FAFSA or the DREAM Act application, but then they might have a separate one on top of that, outside of the GPA verification form, right? So the most common one that many students have heard about is the CSS profile. It's possible that some private schools have developed their own application that they want on top of what's listed on the screen here. So those are those cases where you want to do some research and find out what else they might require. If they do require a CSS profile application, if you're a low-income student, I strongly encourage you to read the information about a fee waiver, because there is a cost associated with the CSS profile. Outside of that, every other application on here is free. So please don't pay anybody to file one of these applications. We are all here to support you, and so please don't pay anybody to do that. All right, so now you know how to apply. Some additional resources for applying. There are videos, lots of videos online. So if this is the first time that you're doing a financial aid application, it can be overwhelming. Know that there's some logic within the application. So based on how you answer the first question will lead into the next questions that it's going to ask you. But if you're a little concerned about how to do it, or you want to watch some videos first, here are some video links. So there's certainly one on our financial aid website at UC Berkeley. You don't need to be a student to check these out, but you can go there and look at our financial aid video. FAFSA and DREAM Act both have videos available. We'll make sure that we put the links to all of these either in the chat or get them to you so you have access to them. There are also video resources in Spanish on the Berkeley website. CSAC, so this is the organization that awards the entity that awards Cal Grants. They have videos as well. So lots of information out there if you want to watch these before you get started. It's important to know that you have until March 2nd in California. You need to apply for financial aid every year. Things to have handy, make sure you have your taxes, yours and or your parents, if you're a dependent student, which we'll talk about in a moment. For the next academic year that's coming up, you're going to use 2020 taxes. So just remember, whatever aid year you're going to start, it's taxes from 2 years prior. So have all of those things handy as you get ready to go into the application, okay? So we've done that, now you know how to apply. We get a lot of questions about family structures because they can be different for every student. And so which parent do I use? And do I use both parents? And lots of questions about whose information should be on the FAFSA or on the DREAM Act application. And so these are just some rules of thumb that are good to have handy when you're getting ready to do your aid application. So if your parents are married or unmarried, but they live together, you do need to include both of your parents' information on your aid application. If your parents are divorced or separated, then you want to use the parent that you lived with the most during the last 12 months. So this is where we're going to do some myth busting, because I think that a lot of students and families believe that whoever claimed the student is the parent that has to be on the aid application, and that's not necessarily true. So again, divorced or separated, use the parent that you lived with the most during the last 12 months. If your parents are married or unmarried and living together, that doesn't quite make sense, does it? Okay, so if your parents you have two households, and you split your time pretty evenly, you want to use the parent that provided more than half of your support. And really what that should say is the parents are unmarried and you split your time pretty evenly. So I apologize for that. I didn't catch that error there on the third one. You want to report the information for the parent that provided more than half of your support during that 12-month period. In that case, it might be the parent that claimed you on the tax return. And then the last one is, if you're living with one parent, it's very clear that that would be the parent that you would use. If that parent is remarried, you do need to include the step parent's information on your aid application. This one can be a tough one too for students and families to absorb, because it could be the case that the step parent is not supporting the student or they're not on the tax return. And unfortunately, that's not something that the federal or the state government consider when they are asking for information on an aid application. So again, these are just kinds of rules of thumb to have handy. So keep that in mind as well. All right, so let's see. So this is just a visual image. It's an infographic of which parent to use. So it kind of guides you through some of the things that we just talked about. And so which parent to use. So it just gives you a little bit of a which direction to go based on, is the parent remarried? Yes, you need to report them as well. So this is a little bit of a guide. And again, we'll make sure that you have this so that you know which parent needs to be included in what. And what I will say is that the DREAM application and the FAFSA application both align with this, even though this says FAFSA. And CSS profile will have very specific instructions about which parents to use. And those guidelines can be different from what they are on the FAFSA and everything I just shared about which parent to include. Sometimes the CSS profile schools want you to include both parents regardless of their marital status. Okay, so keep that in mind. So a little more myth busting. So we often get families and students that ask about independence. And so I didn't claim the student on my tax return, so they must be financially independent. Or the student made, X amount of money and they filed their own taxes, so they must be financially independent for financial aid purposes. And that's not exactly how it works. There are a whole series of questions within the aid application that we use to determine whether a student is dependent or independent, which means that if you're dependent, you need to provide parent information. Okay, so these are the questions for the 22-23 aid application. So for next academic year, these are the questions you would be asked now. So were you born before 1999? And really the question is more around, are you 24? Are you going to be 24? That seems to be the age cutoff that the government considers. Are you married? These are all questions to the student. Are you married? You as a student, are you going to be a graduate student? And I think I saw in the chat that we do have some graduate students or potential soon to be graduate students. That would make you independent if you're a graduate student. Are you in the military? Are you a veteran? Do you have your own legal dependents? Do you have your own children that you are supporting? Were you awarded the court? Were you in foster care? Are you homeless or at risk of being homeless? So these are all the kinds of questions that get asked. If you answer no to all of these questions, then you are required to provide parental information. There are a few exceptions we'll talk about much later, but just know that this is sort of the guide that we use to determine whether a student is dependent or independent. Okay, and all schools will use this. So you know how to apply, you know what financial aid is, you know which parent to include. If you are, you'll know if you are dependent or independent. So then what happens? So all this information gets collected. You give us information about yourself, about your parent, about the income, the household size, the number in college. You give us all that information. And what ends up happening is that all that information goes to either the federal government or the state government, and they make a determination of verifying the information that's on an aid application. And really what that means, you didn't do anything wrong. Really what that means is they want to do kind of a quality assurance check, if you will, to see if the information on the aid application is accurate. And they select about 30% of all aid applicants at every school. So for us, that's like, I don't know, like 7,000 students or something that get selected and have to go through this process each year. You don't necessarily get selected every year, although at our school, a good number of our students get selected year after year. It's just important to know that this is something that could happen. And again, didn't do anything wrong. It's just something to be prepared for. So they may ask you for additional documents, they being the school, not the federal or the state government, but the individual school that you end up attending may be asking you for income information. So they may ask for tax information if you are a income tax filer. If you're not, then they want you to document that you don't have to file taxes, and you can do that with the IRS, or you can write a statement usually. They might also just be asking about your household size. They might be asking about who else is in college. They may be asking about citizenship or social security number. They may be asking you to document that you graduated from high school. So just bear in mind that there could be additional documentation that you have to submit to the school after you apply for financial aid. And so I share this with you only because it's a good percentage of students that get selected. And it's very possible that you will need to turn this in before any financial aid actually comes your way from that specific school. Okay, so keep that in mind. So I want to turn a little bit over to talking about partnership and how this all kind of works, right? So we as financial aid administrators, we're really your partners. I think we often are, or the perception of who we are, what we do is often that we are barriers, and we're have some really bureaucratic processes, which we do. But ultimately we are here as your partners. Like if you have questions, we are the folks that should be answering those questions and guiding you through this process. Okay, so just keep that in mind, that this should really be what you're experiencing at the schools that you're considering. And so I also encourage you to really think about your education and financing your education as a partnership, especially with public schools. And that partnership is between you, the student, and your parents. If you're a dependent student, it's between the federal and the state government that are providing financial aid. And then it's with us as well. So this is going to be a group effort. And especially at public schools, it's not uncommon for all three of those entities, or four of us, I guess, really, to be contributing financially towards your educational expenses. We're all investing. And so I think it's just important to remember that. Some private institutions have more funding than the public institutions. And so students and families may be asked to contribute toward those educational expenses. Even those lowest income households may be asked to contribute in some way. And so we'll talk about what that actually looks like, but I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind. So this is where I want to talk a little bit about the differences between public and private institutions. And I kind of alluded to it a minute ago. Some schools have a lot more money in terms of grants and scholarships available to award to their students. And so the amount that you get from one institution to another could vary pretty drastically, right? And how they award that money can vary based on a number of things, right? And so, for example, it could be based on just merit criteria at some schools. So it could be just GPA. If the school is still using test scores, it could be test scores and GPA. There are scholarships. I used to work at an art school. And so we would look at the artistic portfolio and determine how much scholarship we were going to award. It could be athletic ability. We certainly give millions of dollars to student athletes, musical talent. So it could be any number of things that the school uses as criteria for awarding their scholarship dollars. A few other differences between public and private schools. We talked a little bit about what type of applications the schools might use, right? Some just use FAFSA or DREAM Act and Cal Grant GPA. Some use that and CSS profile. So that could be different between public and private. I think there's only one public institution that uses CSS profile. I think it's Michigan. I think the rest of the schools that use profile are private schools. So that's a huge difference. It's important to know that most public institutions, if you attend a public school outside of the state of California, they will likely charge you out of state tuition on top of their in-state tuition. We do that at the UC system, which is about an additional $30,000 a year. So it's always important to do your research if you're going to go out of state or if residency is a concern. Private schools do not charge out of state. They just typically have much higher tuition charges all around. So keep that in mind. That's a huge difference between public and private schools. Some other things that are very, very different between public and private is that public schools typically don't negotiate offers. Like I said at the beginning, some schools have, less money to award than others. And so we are often asked, we get students that are admitted to Berkeley and are admitted to other UCs or other private schools, and they want us to match those other offers. And we simply just are not in a position to do that as a public school because we don't have that kind of money. And so private schools, on the other hand, might do that for you. If you get an offer from Stanford and you get another offer from Harvard, those two folks might negotiate for you. So just keep those things in mind where those schools could be very, very different based on whether they're public or private. And then the last thing I will say is that don't be surprised if you see loans and work study in your financial aid offer, especially when it comes to public schools. It wouldn't be uncommon to see that in your offer, because again, it's about how much money does the institution have to award to students on top of whatever the federal and the state government can award. So these are just all things to keep in mind. It's more information for you so that you are prepared to ask those questions when the time comes. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, we know how to apply, we know which parent to use, we know what makes you independent, we're your partners in this, some differences between public, private. So you do all of this, you apply, then what happens? Okay. Well, then the schools that you send your information to, like ours, we take all that information and we have to figure out, of all the students that applied to us and gave us their information, who has financial need. And this is the formula that we're going to use to figure that out. Every school uses this formula. And so what we do is we figure out how much it costs to attend our school for 1 year, and that's called the cost of attendance. We subtract out the expected family contribution. So after you fill out your aid application, you've given us all this information about you and your family. The federal and the state government take that data and they plug it into this federal formula or state formula, and they come up with a number that they think, they believe that you and your family can contribute toward your education. Okay. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's what expected family contribution means. And so we take the total cost, we subtract out what the formula says you contribute, And that tells us how much financial need you have. And this is really, really important for determining what actually goes into your financial aid package, right? What types of awards and the amounts, okay? So let's break this formula apart a little bit. And I'm going to actually start with the family contribution first. So I started to explain this a little bit. So what is your family contribution? So what it is in essence, it's a measure of financial strength. How much can you actually contribute toward the student's educational expenses for 1 year? It's considers the students and a family's application. So it's partly what the student tells us as their income and assets, and also what the parent tells us, income, assets, number of people they're supporting, number of people in college, all of that. The age of the older parent, that all matters, because the closer they are to retirement, it impacts the formula, right? And so what we do with this EFC, we call it EFC, expected family contribution, is it helps us figure out what types of financial aid you're eligible for. Are you eligible for a Pell Grant? Are you eligible for a Cal Grant? It helps us figure those things out. And it's important to know that you're only going to file 1 to 8 application, right? Like 1 each year, whatever type the school needs. That expected family contribution, you might be doing 1 application, but sending it to 5 schools, 10 schools. That expected family contribution is the same at every single school. The cost of attendance might change, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but the family contribution is the same regardless of which school you go to. Okay, so it's important to know that. So what the family contribution isn't, this is also important. It's a little bit of myth busting as well. So it does not represent the amount that you as a student or your parents or family have to pay to the university or college, okay? It does not represent the amount of money of financial aid that you're going to receive from the college. And again, it should not be different at every single school. It should be the same, okay? So this just gives you an idea of what we do with all your information and becomes your EFC. And we use, this is kind of how we use this, okay? The other part of this formula, so we've done this part. Let's talk a little bit about the cost of attendance now, because we're going to get to financial need in a moment. So EFC, so what's the cost of attendance? This number represents how much financial aid we as an institution need to award you so that you have enough money to cover all the expenses we think you're going to have by virtue of being a student on our campus for 1 year, okay? And so it is solely an estimate of what it could cost for 1 year. Let's go ahead and get into direct and indirect costs, because I want you to see what I'm talking about in terms of direct and indirect. And then just know that the cost of attendance can be very different from one school to the next. Some schools are much more expensive than others, right? So what I want to show you is just what's included. First, let me show you what's included in the cost of attendance, and then we'll get into some numbers. So what goes into the cost of attendance? Tuition and fees, right? Just by virtue of being a student. Housing, because you need somewhere to live as a student. Food, books and supplies, transportation. Personal expenses, we all need to go buy our own personal expenses. So shampoo, toothbrush, all those sorts of things, right? We have personal expenses. We throw in loan fees. I would say ignore this for now, but that's typically what we do on our campus. Not all schools do this. And then health insurance. Health insurance can vary from school to school. Within the UC system, all of our students are required to have some form of health insurance. And so either you have your own or you purchase the university insurance. So just know it's always one thing to look for and ask is how health insurance works on that particular campus. And it's particularly important right now, right? It has been over the last couple of years. And so I encourage you to ask those questions. What's typically not included in the cost of attendance? So we have students that have their own financial obligations by the time they come to us. It's important to know that your financial aid is not, does not include funding for those expenses typically. Okay, so things like car payments, you have credit cards or consumer debt, financial aid is not intended to support that. If you are married or you have a partner, again, your financial aid is intended to be just for you as a student. Expenses for children, typically this is not included up front. I don't know if we have any parenting students with us tonight, but schools handle this differently. Berkeley, LA, some of the other UCs are very generous when it comes to parenting students, because we know you're going to have some additional expenses solely by, being a student and having children. And so we do include some of those, but that varies from school to school. So I encourage you to do research. And then any expenses that you have outside in those periods when you're no longer enrolled, like summer, for example, if you're not enrolled in summer, any expenses you incur there are not things that we would include in your cost of attendance. Okay. So this gives you an idea of what we do plan for, what we do not plan for. And then the total cost could be different, especially around housing and food based on where you live, right? And so where you live also impacts how much it could cost you for 1 year. So if you're on campus in a residence hall, which is like a dorm, versus an on-campus apartment and an off-campus apartment or living with family, all of this impacts how much money you might need for 1 year. Okay. So let's take a look at what that looks like. How does this translate in a real cost of attendance? So I'm going to show you Berkeley solely as an example, but this will give you an idea of what to go look for on other websites of those schools that you're interested in. Okay. So this is Berkeley's for, I think this is this year, actually, not last year. This is 2021, which could have just been me mistyping that. So I do think this is 21-22. But this gives you an idea of how your living arrangement could impact your cost of attendance, right? So you see the differences down here. This tends to be where people have sticker shock, to be honest with you, is these numbers down here at the bottom, but I want to break it down a little bit because that's not necessarily the amount that you have to pay the university. And I think that's what people think when they see that bottom line number. And so let's break it down a little bit. So there's two categories of expenses here. There are direct costs. So these are the kinds of expenses that the university may charge the student directly. Okay. So what are those things? So tuition, if you enroll, right, we're going to charge you tuition and fees because you're a student. There may be some additional campus fees that the university might charge. This typically shows up with public institutions as opposed to private. Room and board, if you live on campus, and in these two columns here, you would be living on campus. This gives you an idea of the average cost. Even these numbers can vary based on what kind of apartment or what kind of dorm you're in and how many roommates you have, right? Some rooming options are double, so just 2 people to a room, some triple, some are quad, so as many as 4 people in a room. And the costs could vary based on that, right? It could go down the more people that are in a room. So, but this gives you an idea of the average on our campus. This is our health insurance cost for this year. This also is going to vary from campus to campus, but the important thing here is that these are the kinds of expenses that the university could charge you for directly. Okay. Then you have a whole other set of expenses that you're going to have solely because you're a student. Okay. So they're not things necessarily that the university is going to send you a bill for, but you need money for food, for example. We don't expect our students to eat just dorm food, because at some point it's just too much and you need to go eat somewhere else, right? So we put in a little extra money for that. You all need to buy books. Some universities charge you for books and some do not. We do not. So that's always something to ask. Like, does the student get billed for their books and supplies? It's good to know whether that happens or not. I put it in here as an indirect expense because we don't charge students for that. They have to purchase those on their own or borrow or rent or do something else. Then there are personal expenses. So we talked about needing, like shampoo and toothpaste and stuff. Those are expenses you're going to have, but not necessarily something we are going to charge you for. So it's indirect. Same thing for transportation. So if you add up those two categories of expenses, that's where you get to the total cost of attendance. We use this number to figure out how much financial aid you need for 1 year, whether we're charging you for those expenses or not, right? We just want to make sure you have enough to meet all of the possible expenses that you're going to have. Now, remember, when I said, what does financial aid mean? Financial aid means grants, scholarships, loans, and work study. So we will figure out how much to give you that you are eligible for up to this total amount. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. But it gives you an idea of how we use this information to come up with your financial aid package. A couple of other important things to note here. When we're looking at this for Berkeley, for example, this is for a California resident. If we have students coming here from out of state, they have to plan for about this much, the number here at the bottom, plus non-resident tuition or out-of-state tuition. So these numbers at the bottom plus almost $30,000 more. Okay, so if you are thinking about going out of state and it is a public institution, you want to look at what is the additional tuition that you might get. You might have to consider how you're going to pay for. Okay, so keep all of those things in the back of your mind. I just wanted to point that out: public, private, in-state, out-of-state difference. Okay. So that's Berkeley example, but certainly go look at all the schools that you're interested in to get a sense. Let's talk a little bit about the types of awards now that you have a sense of how much we might need to try and offer you for one academic year. These are some pretty basic types of awards that we offer to students. So federal, these are typical state awards. These are typical university or college awards. And then these are private awards that could be available to you. So I just put them in these categories because it's a little bit easier to digest all the different types. And I know I need to get moving here because I'm starting to run out of time here. So Cal Grant awards were in the state column, right? So let's talk about that a little bit. Like I said before, they do require that you file either the FAFSA or the DREAM Act application and the GPA verification form. Then there are additional requirements. So again, we'll make sure that you get this PowerPoint so that you have all the links. There are additional requirements. So there's a GPA requirement, income and household size and assets all play into this. And so, and you need to be obviously a California resident to qualify for a Cal Grant. And then remember, March 2nd is the deadline. But this award at a public institution would cover this cost here. Okay, so at a UC school, because this number is the same at all UC schools, it would cover this. If that tuition cost is, $10,000 at a CSU, your Cal Grant would cover that portion. So if you're eligible, so it's important to always apply to be eligible for a Cal Grant. Let's talk a little bit about the types of awards that are offered across the UC system. If you're thinking about a UC. So if you are a California resident, if your family's total income is $80,000 or less, if you file your aid application and the GPA verification form by March 2nd, the commitment from the UC system is to make sure that you have enough in grants and scholarships to pay for that system-wide tuition and fee, the number I just showed you, which was at $12,570. They want to make sure that you have at least enough to cover that. To be very honest with you, households and students that meet this criteria often get much more than that. And so then they don't see a blue and gold scholarship or grant. But if for some reason you don't have enough to at least cover the tuition, the commitment is that we will make sure that you do. This is very similar to what some other private schools have done. So I'm trying to think of some of them now. I don't know exactly the cutoffs, but many of them are like, if your income is $150,000 or less, we'll make sure that your tuition is free. That's basically what this is. I forget what they call it, but That's in essence what this is saying. We want to make sure that you don't have to pay tuition if your total income is under $80,000 and you meet these other requirements. Okay. Typically, if you meet those requirements, you will have much more than that at most public institutions. Some other state awards include middle class scholarships. So students that come from households where maybe the income is higher, a little bit higher, kind of middle, not the lowest incomes, not necessarily eligible for a Cal Grant, maybe not necessarily eligible for a Pell Grant. There's also funding for house students that come from middle income households. This is an award that is determined by the California Student Aid Commission. They help us figure it out. They tell us who's eligible and for how much. These are the requirements to be eligible for that. If you have a Cal Grant, you won't get this, so it really, the goal here is to try and help pay for some of that tuition. Your Cal Grant already pays for tuition, so you wouldn't get this on top of that. And the amount varies based on the income in the household. So the higher the income, the smaller the award, the lower the income, the higher the award. So, and it does take into consideration other forms of financial aid that you receive. It's super complicated. They figure out how to award it. They just tell us who to give it to and how much. And then of course there are outside scholarships. I strongly, strongly, strongly encourage you to invest the time in applying for outside scholarships. Set aside 30 minutes a month and start doing this, an hour a month, start doing this. You're writing essays anyway, likely for your admissions applications, use those, just tweak them, change them, and apply for scholarships. These are some places where you can get started. Again, go to our website. We have plenty of search engines there, but College Board, Best Colleges Scholarship, go there and invest the time and start in those local places that you're comfortable with. What else? I want to talk a little bit about work study. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I did say that don't be surprised if you see loan and work study in your financial aid package at public schools. This is one way to maybe keep the borrowing down. Maybe you can work instead of borrowing loans to help pay for some of those out-of-pocket expenses. Work study is considered financial aid. However, it is paid directly to you, the student. It doesn't go toward your bill. It's like any other job. You get paid every couple of weeks or month, however, the school pays you, but it does go directly to you. So keep that in mind. And if you're not eligible for work study, certainly check the career center on whatever campus you're looking into to see what kind of jobs might be available to you. I want to put this in here only because, there are some loans are better than others. They are typically part of a package. We don't want students to borrow unless they absolutely have to. And bear in mind that the school is likely going to offer you the maximum amount that they can offer you. That doesn't mean that's what you have to borrow if you are going to borrow. Borrow only what you absolutely need if you need to. And then borrow the best type of loan first, which is the type that does not accrue interest while you're in school, right? And that's the subsidized loan. These two here do accrue interest. I, again, don't want to spend a lot of time on them, but just know that they can be part of a typical package, okay? So let's talk a little bit about affordability. So I've given you all this information and now you have a financial aid offer in front of you. How do I know which school is giving me the better offer, right? Like, that's not an easy thing to figure out. And so what you want to do is take the cost of attendance, which is that total cost of everything that it could possibly cost you for 1 year. Take that total sticker number and subtract out any grants and scholarships that they're giving you, okay? The difference between those two numbers represents, at most schools, it represents the amount of loan, work study, or just a gap. Like they didn't offer you anything. That's the part that could come out of your pocket potentially, or that you may need to borrow, or that you may need to work toward. The larger that number, the more expensive it is, okay? So the lower the net cost means that they're giving you more grants and scholarships. So don't just look at the amount of a $10,000 scholarship, right? If we're giving you 5, but some other school's giving you 10. If that school costs more, that's not necessarily helpful, right? And so you want to do this math of subtracting the difference and looking at that number. And it's called the net cost or the net price. That's typically what it's called from school to school. Okay. So let me give you an example of how this can make a little more sense. Okay. So what I did is, I'm going to hide my picture here. Hang on. Okay. So what I did was I went to 3 different types of schools. So I looked at ours. I looked at CSU. I think this was East Bay. And then I did a community college here in the Bay Area. And what I went and did is I went onto a calculator that I will show you in a moment. And I said, all right, I am a student who has a 0 family contribution. So I come from a very low income family. And I'm going to be living on my own. I'm not living at home with any relatives. So I'm either in an apartment. In this case, I think I chose a residence hall. I don't remember. Yeah, I think it's a residence hall because that's pretty high for us. So I'm living in a dorm. I'm not living at home. I have a 0 family contribution. And I did that for each one of these. And so on the surface, the UC school looks like the most expensive, right? Our cost of attendance is the highest of the 3. So you might be thinking, well, yeah, UC is too expensive. I don't think I can afford it. Well, let's talk about that. Because if the amount of grants and scholarships that a UC can offer you is about $33,000, then the amount of loan and work in your financial aid package might be $9,800. At least for us this year it is. Okay. If we do that same calculation at a state school, CSU, that's a little bit different, right? The net cost is then $12,500, and that could be the amount of loan and work in your package. So right now, the UC is looking a little bit better than the CSU, right? Because we're giving you more in grants and scholarships. Then when we look at community college, and again, you need to remember this is not someone living at home, because living at home could change this whole community college picture. But if you are living off campus on your own, community colleges don't have a significant amount of grants and scholarships to award, right? And so that number is much lower compared to a UC or a CSU, right? So that cost to go to community college could be much higher because they have less money to award. So don't assume, I guess the takeaway from this is don't assume that just because a school is more expensive, that you're not going to be able to afford it, right? It could actually be more affordable based on the amount of money that they have to award. I hope that makes sense. And that's why comparing, this is your apples to apples comparison for your net cost and what you can afford when the time comes to start comparing. Every school that awards federal financial aid is required to have something called a net cost or a net price calculator. So I didn't just make these numbers up. I actually plugged them into a calculator for each of those schools. And those are the pieces of information that it spit out. And so ours is listed here at the bottom, but every single school. So if you go to their website and in their search box type net cost or net price calculator, you will find it. And you plug in your information. It's not as detailed as the FAFSA or the DREAM app, but plug in the information. The more accurate your information, the better the estimate. And remember, it's just an estimate, but it gives you an idea of what to expect. So I know there are parents in here with seniors. Get on those websites and start looking at net cost calculators so that you have a sense of what to potentially expect. And you want to use your 2020 income tax return. Okay. So another tool, hopefully this will help you when the time comes. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about appeals, because like I said before, when you are filing your aid application, you are using income from 2020. By the time you start school, it could be 2022. Things could be very, very different in that 2-year window, right? Especially the last 2 years. And so we have received a significant number of appeals because family financial circumstances have changed drastically, right? And so we often get questions of like, how do I appeal? How do I get more information? What do I need to do? And so each school handles this differently. And so this is really meant to be, sorry, I just knocked something over. This is really meant to be a rule of thumb and just give you, again, some guidelines, some language, some questions to ask, right? So we call ours a family contribution appeal. It could be called something different at other campuses, but a professional judgment, they're called different things. But really what you would be asking is, hey, my family's income has changed. Is there an appeal so that you can reconsider my financial aid package in our circumstances? And so what does that look like? So the typical things that schools consider are, if the income has gone down or if someone has lost their job completely, if there was untaxed income that families were receiving, like disability or child support, those sorts of things, and that has ended, right? That changes your financial circumstances. So we can consider those things. Changes in marital status, right? Like it's not uncommon for divorces to happen, right? And so those things change your financial circumstances. So what else? One-time payments. So sometimes, especially during the last couple of years, we've seen families that have taken maybe a payout from their retirement because they needed to make ends meet, and that was one time. We can consider that and take that out of the equation. There might be unusual or necessary expenses, especially around medical expenses, that people have to pay out of pocket. We can consider those sorts of things. So keep that in mind. There are ways to do this. They are separate outside of the aid application. They're a separate appeal process with the individual schools. So do a little bit of research on that. When we started this conversation, we talked a little bit about what makes a student dependent versus independent. There was a whole series of questions that I showed you. So like your age, are you married, do you have children, veteran, ward of the court, all those sorts of things. And I said, if you answered no to all of those questions, you're required to provide parent information. And that is true. It's also true that there are some exceptions. In financial aid, we like to say that there's always an exception, right? One size does not fit all. And so we do have circumstances. We have students who have unusual and extreme circumstances happening in their life, where the answer to all those questions is no, and there still is not going to be a way to get parental information. And so if we have students that are experiencing those unusual circumstances, we encourage you to come talk to us and speak with us about what your circumstances are. And we're trying to be mindful of doing that in a way that does not re-traumatize the student and cause more harm. But what I will say is that we also have to have enough information to guide you in the process so that you know what documentation to provide us. So some of the typical circumstances that we see under an independence appeal, or what we reserve our independence appeals for, are for abandonment. We have students who might come out to their families about their sexual orientation or how they identify, and that causes a rift, and that is the end of that relationship. And so those abuse, so those are the kinds of things that we typically reserve our independence appeals for. We do not consider appeals for parents who just refuse to provide information. Like if you just, nope, my student's independent, I'm not providing anything. That's not a reason for an independence appeal. At least not on our campus. And I think most financial aid administrators would agree with me that that's not grounds for an appeal. So if you do have one of those circumstances, I do encourage you to find someone at those institutions that you can talk to about doing this. You should still file your aid application. You can complete it without parent information, at least get it done by the March 2nd deadline, and then reach out to those schools to find out what the process is. Okay. And then just important to know, like, not all the appeals we get, submitting an appeal is not a guarantee of approval, right? So always just keep that in the back of your mind. The more information and documentation you can give us to complete the story, and so that we have enough context to make our decision, is useful. So just keep that in mind as well. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about resources and reminders. We're coming up to the end here so that we have time for questions. So a few reminders. You need to apply for financial aid every year, right? It's not a one and done. You have to do it every single year. You want to apply for outside scholarships every single year that you are enrolled in college, from undergraduate all the way through till when you're done. So graduate school and beyond. It matters. It matters because the commitment on our campus and across the UC system in most schools is that we will reduce your subsidized loans and your work study before we're going to reduce your grants and scholarships. We want you to have as much free money that you are eligible for and entitled to as possible. So we don't want you to borrow. We don't want you to work if you don't have to. And that's where those outside scholarships can be really, really important. Okay. Be prepared to see all types of financial aid in your package, right? We talked about loans and work study. Don't be surprised if you see those in your aid offer, especially from public schools. Review the cost of attendance every year. It changes from year to year, right? Certain expenses go up. Most of the time they're going up as opposed to going down. And your living arrangement might change, right? So always look at the cost of attendance every year to see what those differences are. Look at the net cost, not the sticker cost, right? So don't just look at the cost of attendance. Cost of attendance minus the grants and scholarships will help you figure out how to compare school to school. Know that we do accept appeals in special circumstances. And then this last piece is going to lead us into tips and resources. So I have been talking at you for almost an hour now. And this can be stressful. Finances, money, our relationships with money, all of that can be stressful. It can be scary. And if that's how you're feeling while you're on campus, that can impact your overall wellness. It can impact your academic performance. It can impact all sorts of things, your health. And so it's always really important to see what kinds of financial wellness and what kind of tools do your schools offer. Okay. We have to approach this from a holistic sort of lens, right? And so if you're stressed about finances, other things can start to be impacted, right? And so what do those schools offer that could be helpful to you as you're going through this process? These are some of the things that we offer on our campus, but again, I want to give you some language or questions to ask of those other schools or things to go research on those other campuses that could be useful to you. So on our campus, we have a basic needs program center. We offer all sorts of different services. You know, life happens, emergencies happen, unusual circumstances happen. And so what does the school offer outside of financial aid to make sure that you're not worried about housing, that you're not worried about food, so that you're not worried about emergencies that may arise? These are some of the things that we offer. They change from school to school. We help our students complete CalFresh applications so that they have an additional, I think it's $192 a month to use toward their food expenses outside of their financial aid, right? And so what do those schools that you're thinking about offer? So just keep that in mind. You can check our website just to get a sense of services, see what other schools offer. We spend a lot of time with our students that are also parents. They have children. We have dedicated folks that support our student parent center. And so, we're often making adjustments, adding more things and more aid to their package because they have additional expenses. And so we do that on our campus. We have about 350-ish, almost 400 student parents on our campus as undergraduates. And so, see what other schools are offering. We have special awards too for student parents. And then financial wellness, right? Like not everybody knows how to create a budget. Not everybody knows how to manage money. We all had to learn how to do that. All of these things I'm talking about, someone had to teach us, had to teach me. And so we have a peer program where students on our campus teach other students like you how to manage their money. So how do you build a spending plan or budget? How do you manage your debt? How do you save? Credit cards, identity theft. We have students that teach other students. And for us, it's called Bears for Financial Success. Most schools have some sort of financial literacy or financial wellness program. So I encourage you to seek those out, see what they offer and what's available to you, because someone's got to teach you how to do these things. And it shouldn't be something that's embarrassing. We all need to learn how to do it so that we are prepared for the future. Okay. So we are at the end here. And so I think I'm turning it back over to Edmund.
Hi, everyone.
Oh,
I
wait.
just wanted to say thank you so much, Silvia. All of this information that you shared is so important. And just the last piece, I remember being a college student and going to the financial aid office or calling and just asking for all the resources that I could get because I was the first in my family to attend and it was all really confusing for myself and my parents. And so it's so wonderful to see that Berkeley and all of these colleges do have some resources for you all. And just to plug in, her Vagabond Roots also gives scholarships. And so I invite you all to stay connected, follow us on Instagram, on Facebook, check out our website because we do give scholarships and it's usually around the summer so that the student gets the money for the fall. Next year, we will be giving almost $30,000 in scholarships for folks who live in the Nev area, the Northeast Valley area, which is Silmar, San Fernando, Pacoima, and Arleta. And so if you live in that area, please apply. And we also do nationwide scholarships. So just stay connected, check back. And that is also another resource that you can have. So I think now we're going to do some, actually we're going to do the Q&A, but we have this here because we want to invite you all to sign in. The tinyurl.com/HVBR40. Please sign up because we will be sending this recording alongside all of the links that Silvia spoke about throughout her presentation. So please make sure that you drop your email, that you sign up using this URL, and also so that you can enter for the giveaway for the 4 Target gift cards that we'll be giving at the end of this workshop.
So yeah, do we want to get into, are there questions in the chat that we want to get into?